All right, I know we have people just joining us right now. We'll get ready. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. We'll let a few more people join in, and then we will be underway. All right, and again, if you're just joining us right now, we'll give it just another minute, and then we'll get started. Really excited to hear from Keith Phaneuf this morning as we talk all things budget and what's going on at the legislature. All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I know we have more people jumping on the line right now. My name is Garrett Sheehan. I'm the President and CEO of the Greater New Haven Chamber of Commerce and President of the Quinnipiac Chamber of Commerce. We're really excited to have this special Government Affairs Committee meeting this morning. If you're not involved with our Government Affairs Committees, either at Quinnipiac or Greater New Haven Chamber, please get involved. We meet monthly. Katie Ambrosio on our team leads from the public policy standpoint. She works regularly advocating for bills that are important for our region and also updating us on all issues happening in Greater New Haven. It's a great way to get connected to things happening in current events and be involved and be advocates for the business community. So highly encourage everyone to get involved with our Government Affairs Committee. We have Karen Del Vecchio with us from Pat Munger Construction, and Karen's the chair of our Quinnipiac Chamber Government Affairs Committee. So I'm going to turn things over to Karen to welcome our guests and get us started. Karen?
Thanks, Garrett. I appreciate that. Yeah, my name is Karen Del Vecchio. I'm the Business Development Manager with Pat Munger Construction in Brantford, and we're happy to have Keith with us this morning. So Keith has spent most of his 31 years as a reporter specializing in state government finances, analyzing such topics as income tax equity, waste in government, and the complex funding systems behind Connecticut's transportation and social services networks. He has been the state finances reporter at the Connecticut Mirror since it launched in 2010. Prior to joining the Connecticut Mirror, Keith was state Capitol Bureau Chief for the Journal-Inquirer of Manchester, a reporter for the Day of New London, and a former contributing writer to the New York Times. Keith is a graduate of and a former journalism instructor at the University of Connecticut. Welcome, Keith. So before we jump into questions, tell us a little bit about Connecticut Mirror for those that are not familiar.
Thank you, Karen, and I really want to thank the Chamber for inviting me. It seems so like it was so quick, but it was actually 13, 14 years ago in 2010 when some nonprofits formed the Connecticut Mirror. Our task was to basically start covering what all the other newspapers were ignoring, which was state politics and policy. And we launched, and we were instantly hailed as the most boring website around. We were ignored and made fun of, and the story probably should have ended there, but it didn't, because the people who wrote the Mirror and the people who read the Mirror, which back then was largely the same number of people, cared about it too much to let it go away. So we kept at it. And those people sometimes are called obsessive or quixotic. To me, they're just called Mirror fans. And 14 years later, we're the largest news bureau in the state capital. We're still around, and we're largely around because of groups like yourself. Our readers, I won't get into it all, but our model is basically like NPR's. We get almost none of our money from advertising. It's almost all from donations. So if you like the Mirror, visit the site, look at how you can donate. If you like this talk, tell a friend. If you don't like the Mirror or this talk, this is a time for quiet contemplation, for months and months of silent reflection. But if you consider yourself a Mirror fan, please consider going to our site and looking for a way to support us. So thank you for letting me give you my quick spiel.
That's great. I appreciate that. So we have some questions for Keith this morning, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. we're planning on ending at about 9:30. So let's jump right in. This year's budget has drawn a lot of attention with the big push to deliver a state income tax rate cut for the first time since the mid-90s. Can you talk to us about who will benefit from this and by how much?
Sure. That's always going to be the big headline. I mean, the truth is, we know the reality in life is taxes generally go up. They don't usually go down. And the history of the income tax since 1991 has largely been the income tax going up. In fact, the last time we cut the income tax by adjusting rates was actually in 1996. Most of our earnings were being taxed at a flat 4.5%. And the legislature and then Governor Rowland created a 3% rate that was just applied to the first $10,000 that an individual makes and the first $20,000 that a couple earns. Now, that doesn't mean the income tax has never been cut since then, but what's happened since then, it's been usually in the form of credits like the property tax credit or personal exemptions. Like I said, usually when it comes to rates, they either go up and or we add new rates. In fact, now I'll just tell you quickly, our income tax is actually a blend of 6 different rates, and depending how much you make, your income can be taxed at a lot of different rates, some at one rate, some at another. So the proposal that's probably gained the most steam is Governor Lamont's. He wants to lower the 2 bottommost marginal rates, the 3% rate, which would be again applied to the first 10,000 that a single person makes, the first 20,000 that a couple makes, that would go from 3% to 2%. The second rate is 5%. That applies for a single person to the next 80,000 you make, and to a couple, to a single person to the next 40,000 they make, and for a couple the next 80. That would go from 5 to 4.5. What do all those numbers mean? Probably between $300 to $600 for a middle-class household. I gave you all the wonky stuff, but the real meat of it is between $300 and $600. Here is the one big asterisk. There's a lot of debate over which household should benefit from this. The governor wants as many as about 1.7 billion filers benefiting. Remember, I said it's a blended income tax, so the more you make, some of your earnings will be taxed at higher rates. You could still make, a couple could make like close to $800,000 and still get the benefit of this income tax cut under the governor's proposal. Legislative committees have talked about paring that down anywhere to as much as you can't make more than, say, $300,000 or $400,000. The budget talks are still going on as we speak. I expect you're going to see something in the middle.
Thank you for that. So there's also plans to bolster the earned income tax credit. Can you talk to us about what that would look like?
Sure. And that is for the folks who aren't familiar with it, the state EITC is a tax credit for the working poor. You do have to be working. You do have to file an income tax return to get the EITC. Generally, we're talking about households that make less than $60,000 a year. Right now, our EITC, it's a piggyback credit. It goes off the federal income taxes EITC. So the value of our credit is about 30.5% of the federal EITC. There's a proposal to bolster it to 40%. That would mean about $210 more a year. Again, we're talking about generally households that are making less than $60,000. One thing that's important to note is this is a refundable credit, Karen, which means that even if you get a credit, after your credit reduces your income tax liability to zero, you don't get any more. So say you have a $200 credit and you owe $100 in taxes. You don't get a $100 refund. The credit reduces you to zero and then you're done. Not with a refundable credit. With a refundable credit, you get the value. So if you owe $100 in taxes and your EITC gives you a $200 credit, you're getting a $100 refund. That does make it somewhat controversial. It is an anti-poverty tool. We are finding in Connecticut, though, that it's phenomenal economic stimulus because the cost of living is so high here. All the households we've done different surveys that show spend that money, and not only do they spend it, they're not spending it on vacations. It's basically going for groceries, diapers, paying off any electric bills you ran or heating bills you ran up over the winter. So that's the EITC in a nutshell. By the way, folks, if you see me look to my phone from time to time, that's me making sure I'm keeping track of the time so Katie doesn't come at me with a big hook, pull me off when it's
Yeah.
time for Q&A.
Yeah, I'm going to keep track too. Between the two of us, we'll hit it right. All right, thanks. So the 10% surcharge on corporate tax was set to expire for income years commencing after December 31st, 2022. However, under the governor's proposal, the 10% surcharge would be extended for 3 additional years. How does the outlook for business tax relief look? So it's very important to our audience for sure.
I can't emphasize this enough, being flip about this. The corporation tax surcharge has been, well, let me paraphrase someone else. One legislator called this either the biggest tease or the biggest bait and switch. We have probably for the last 20 years largely had a surcharge at different times. We talk about taking it off. We defer taking it off constantly. And that's what everybody has proposed doing once again. I'm not trying to single anyone out. Governor Lamont's proposal keeps the surcharge in place. The legislature's finance committee, which is a Democrat-controlled panel, keeps it in place. The Republican budgets keep it in place. It is something that I hear all the time from CBIA as it sends a real negative message about the business climate in Connecticut. I'm not trying to take a side on it, but I just want to at least acknowledge that is something we dangle and not deliver constantly. There was a proposal from Governor Lamont to also reduce the pass-through entity tax. I won't get into all the details, but we're talking about small and mid-sized businesses that don't pay the corporation tax. They used to file their business earnings through the principal's income tax return. In 2018, we set up the pass-through entity tax to try to take advantage of some changes in the federal income tax rules regarding state and local tax deductions. Long story short, the governor proposed about a $60 million tax cut in that area. I will not say it's off the table, but right now, the legislature is prioritizing relief in other areas. So keeping in mind that I bet on the Red Sox every year too, it shows you how good I am at prognosticating. I would say that has an uphill fight right now. Long story short, they're not looking at a lot of business tax relief. The focus is if they deliver the income tax cut, everyone will be happy. That's the perception, I should say.
Very interesting. All right, so another hot topic when you look at any things related to the budget is the baby bonds. So they've gotten the support of a large coalition of community leaders, including the business community. Last week, it was announced that the funding to begin the program on time, which is this July, was found. Can you talk us through baby bonds and how this funding was found?
Absolutely. I'm going to need an extra 3 hours though. So if everyone wants to know. Well, I promise I will do my best to give you folks the Reader's Digest version, but baby bonds, and it was called that because originally we were going to finance it with bonding, with borrowing. It's a wealth redistribution program. Connecticut was going to borrow $50 million a year for 12 years, so that when a child was born into poverty, and specifically the test for that would be if the child was covered by the state's enrolled in the state's Husky, the Medicaid program, health insurance program for poor households, the state was going to deposit $3,200 in trust for each child. The expectation was, I think, that we could see about 15,000 children a year benefiting from this. The money would stay in trust, and the earliest the child could access it would be at age 18. They could actually hold on to that longer. The expectation would be that anywhere from $11,000 to $24,000 is what that original $3,200 would be worth when it was tapped. And the child could use the money only for a limited number of things. It could be invested in higher education, in the purchase of a home, or you could also invest in a business, you could also use it to begin saving for your retirement. After it was passed a couple years ago, I don't know if there was some confusion, again, not trying to take sides, but I mean, literally after the bond package that included this proposal had been signed into law by Governor Lamont, the administration made clear that they weren't comfortable with it. So the leadership at the time passed a bill to appease the governor that said, okay, we can still have a baby bonds program, but the treasurer can't borrow the money without the approval of the bond commission. Well, it puts it then in the same hopper with all the other programs out there. And you might say, well, what's wrong with that? Here's the thing though. The governor has tremendous control over the bond commission. The original baby bonds proposal just said, go borrow the money, treasurer. This one says you can borrow it if the bond commission, which is chaired by the governor, whose agenda is set solely by the governor's budget office. If the governor, who's stated that he has a problem with it, approves it, then you can go borrow the money. That's kind of like me telling you the story of Old Yeller and leaving out that he gets shot at the end. It's kind of an important detail. That put the entire proposal in limbo. So, and that was threatening to hold up the whole budget. And I'll try to wrap this one up. What happened this year is finally they negotiated. The governor was going to lose a lot of votes for the budget, particularly from urban lawmakers. But there were a lot of Democrats in rural Eastern Connecticut who liked baby bonds. The compromise we found was there's about $390 million the state holds in trust. It had to set it aside when we refinanced the teacher's pension. It's money we weren't using. Because of our improved financial situation, the ratings agencies are going to let us tap that money. So we're taking basically 380 up front. That'll save us all the borrowing costs. And we're going to invest that money. And the treasurer is saying that 380 million invested, even as we begin drawing 50 million a year out of it, will give us enough money to do baby bonds, 12 million, 50 million a year for 12 years without actually doing bonds, without actually borrowing money. And we're going to save over $100 million in interest costs. Governor Lamont said, all right, that compromise works. He signed it, so the program starts July 1. And I promise, I want to keep it short. If you want to know more about baby bonds, I will put my email in the chat and you can write me a question and I'll follow it up with more, but I could go on and on.
It's interesting. So that's a great explanation. Thank you for that. That was terrific.
Sure.
For those of us who I feel like I know a little bit about it, but that was very informative. That was terrific. Okay, so let's talk about the state's fiscal health. So over the past few months, the big headlines have been about the progress in the state's fiscal health. Can you talk to us about how big this year's surplus is, and is the revenue boom beginning to slow down?
Well, the surplus, and this is the only conversation, I promise you, Karen, where I'm going to try to make billions of dollars seem small. We have, just to give you guys some perspective, about almost $3 billion surplus projection. 2.95 billion is the current estimate. And to give you some idea, we have 3.3 billion in what's known as the rainy day fund. That's just the emergency budget reserve. That's the most you can have by law. That's equal to 15% of the general fund. In my career, we've never had $1 billion plus surplus until I think it was 2021. This one would be the second largest in state history. That's mostly been Connecticut benefiting from the bull stock market, probably from 2018 until mid 2022. It's also due to the fact that in 2017, we created a new savings program. We'll talk about that more if we get into the guardrails, but it requires us to save a portion of our income tax receipts tied to investment earnings. That savings program, that requirement, and a favorable stock market allowed us to roll up some huge dollars. That said, we're still projecting that savings program will collect a lot of money over the next 2 years, but nothing close to what we've been seeing now. I would say of our current surplus projection, close to half of it is just due to that savings program, is due to quarterly income tax receipts that we can't spend, money that comes from capital gains and dividends. Next year and the fiscal year after that, it's expected to save about $700 million a year. Now that's, 6 years ago, we'd be doing cartwheels over that, but that's about half of what we're seeing this year. So you can look at the glass as half full or half empty, but The reason I'm going to say, lastly, I'm going to make billions seem small. We still have $88 billion of long-term debt. I'm talking about our unfunded pension obligations, our unfunded obligations to the state employee retirement healthcare program, and our bonded debt. So 3.3 in the rainy day fund's great, $3 billion surplus is great. We will be dealing with our long-term debt, no matter what we do with this surplus, probably into the 2040s.
No, all right, thank you. And you did mention guardrails, and that's our next question.
Okay.
This session, the governor has pushed the importance of the spending cap and fiscal guardrails. Can you give us a brief primer on fiscal guardrails and how they're working?
Sure. And I'll point out, I did put my email in the chat. This is
thank
another
you.
one where if people want more details, they may want to follow up. There are 4 guardrails, and I'll go through them, not in the order necessarily of importance, but in the amount of time it'll take to go over them. The quickest one to cover is the bond issuance cap. Remember, Governor Lamont came in, he said he wanted to see a debt diet. It basically, in rough numbers, limits the amount of general obligation bonds we can issue in a fiscal year. Just to clarify, a general obligation bond is money that's repaid out of the general fund. We're talking about bonding for municipal school construction, capital projects at state colleges and universities, open space and farmland preservation, state building maintenance. That's limited about $2 billion a year. That is not transportation borrowing. That's different. That's repaid out of the special transportation fund, largely with gasoline and sales tax receipts. There are 2 savings programs that are out there. The one that gets the headlines is the one that's known as the volatility adjustment. It was passed in 2017. And again, what it said was, we should not be spending all of the income tax receipts tied to capital gains, dividends, and other investment earnings because they're so volatile, hence the name. So the question is, there's a certain amount of receipts that we can spend, and anything over that limit, we treat them like they're not there. We ignore them until the fiscal year's over, and then we crack open the piggy bank, and whatever's there goes straight into the rainy day fund. The rainy day fund's full, it goes into the pension funds, which is what we've been doing in the last few years. This is the controversial part of the volatility adjustment. We didn't sit down and do some exhaustive study on where do we set the threshold. In 2017, we had this big, long fight over a budget. It was almost Halloween before we got a budget. We were well into the fiscal year. So somebody just said, hey, how much did we get last year from investment-related earnings? 3.1 billion? That's the threshold. It didn't come from the burning bush. We just said, what did we get last year? And we put that down. No, we have a little inflationary adjustment. Some people have said, we need to go back and revisit that threshold, that it's forcing us to save too much and it's taking away stuff from other core programs. I'll let the politicians debate that one, but that's the volatility adjustment. The revenue cap is shorter. The revenue cap just says you can't build a budget and play it too fine. We had years when we would approve, hopefully, when you propose spending and revenues, the two match up. Well, we would have budgets where the spending would come within $200,000 of the projected revenue. I mean, no margin for error at all. Now, this revenue cap basically says it's about 98%. You can only budget to spend about 98% of your revenue. And that's not even counting the revenue set aside by the volatility adjustment. It's worth about $300 million, which in the scope of the general fund is about 1.5%, but it's a little cushion. And then lastly, and I apologize for running through these so quickly, the big kicker, the spending cap. This goes back all the way to the income tax. The short version, it is really debatable whether we have a constitutional spending cap, despite the fact that everybody in the state voted for it. There's a lot of legal interpretations, but we have a cap that tries to keep state spending in line with either the growth in personal income or the growth in inflation, whichever is larger. What's controversial about the cap as we rewrote it in 2017 is that aid to distressed municipalities, which is about 2/3 of all municipal aid, about $2 billion a year, used to be exempt from the cap. Now it's not. Our pension contributions used to be exempt from the cap, and they're being slowly phased in. That's significant because everything under the cap basically follows this formula. The things that grow faster than the rate of inflation take away from everything else that doesn't. Usually, pension contributions grow fast. So if they're under the cap, they're like the little puppy that's pushing all the other puppies away from the bowl, and they're going to scarf down all the food. And anything that's subject to the cap but not growing contractually that fast gets pushed out. So pension contributions, raises for state employees, if they grow faster than household income or inflation, they'll get the money. Aid for cities and towns, no law that says they have to grow so fast, they get pushed out. A lot of our social services get pushed out. I'll keep it there, Karen, but believe me, we could go on about the spending cap.
Thank you so much. And I know your email address is in there. And also too, is people should subscribe to your emails for Connecticut Mirror too. It's a great way to stay informed as well. Okay, so where are we? Speaking of fiscal guardrails, the state is also said to be facing staffing shortages with employees retiring. If we're facing a staffing crisis, why are state jobs being left vacant and more spent on overtime? What does this have to do with the budget lapse? Okay, this is something that's really important because even if you think state government should be shrinking, our overtime is growing rapidly. It's over $200 million, meaning it's almost 1% of the entire general fund is just spent on overtime. We have in the budget, and it's the term lapse is just jargon, but it's a savings target. When you build the budget, you have all these different line items that you want to spend money on. And if you want to know the total of the budget, you normally just add up those line items and you get your total. Well, the way the state budgets, before you add up all the numbers and get your total, you then actually install some negative numbers. How much money are we going to save just because of normal turnover? State employees die, they move, they quit, and it might take a month or two to find a replacement, so you save some money. State programs don't start on time. Maybe you start a program, it didn't serve as many people as you anticipated, so there's savings. They call it a lapse because the unspent money lapses back to the general fund, but it's a savings target. You build a realistic one, it's just smart budgeting. You build an enormous one, it's wishful budgeting. Or even some would argue deceptive, because all throughout the Malloy administration, when we had huge deficits, the legislature would build in big lapses. Well, they knew there was really only one way for the governor to solve those lapses, but they didn't want to be the bad guy. So in the budget, we just built in a savings target. In reality, it meant freeze jobs, cut jobs through attrition, delay programs. And then as their constituents said, why can't I get anyone to pick up the phone at DSS? Why can't I do this? The legislature could go, we don't know, talk to the governor. It's no big surprise that staffing went down 10% under Governor Malloy. One of the things they're looking at in this budget to strike a deal is to have a big savings target of more than $100 million. If you see that, realize it's not a no harm, no foul, nice and easy. We're just saving some money, scooping it out of the couch cushions. It means spreading too little butter over too much bread. And I think you're going to continue to see staffing pushed. And that is having an effect, by the way, on a lot of grants now, not getting out the door quickly because staffing is so low. Okay, great. That's great information. Thank you for that. So higher education is crucial to the region's continued growth. However, these institutions are facing challenges in the budget. Can you talk to us about where you see these conversations going in regard to higher education?
Sure. This is a very, very controversial area. It involves, I don't want to say nobody is lying, but everybody's describing the side of the argument that favors them. Governor Lamont correctly points out that his budget proposes an increase in baseline funding, pardon me for doing sarcastic air quotes, for the University of Connecticut, for the regional state universities, and for the community colleges. But for the last few years, that's been just a portion of the money the colleges have gotten. They have gotten hundreds of millions of dollars in surplus and in federal pandemic relief. The governor wants to wean them off that and says, well, you should have known this temporary money. In defense of the universities and colleges, though, we gave them that money knowing they were spending it on ongoing costs. We weren't giving it to them to make a one-time debt payment. We were giving it to them to make payroll. We were giving it to them to take care of student services. When you take a look at what the money the governor is actually giving them from all sources, or I should say what he's proposed giving them, they're looking at anywhere from a 5 to an 8% cut. Both the University of Connecticut and the regional state universities and community college system have all said they're looking at faculty layoffs, looking at big faculty layoffs. That is probably the single biggest reason we do not have a state budget right now. And I think they'll still get one done on time, but they're fighting over that. And again, I feel guilty. I feel like I'm going through these so quick, but I'm trying to watch the time. So if I sound like I'm an auctioneer, I don't mean it that way. I want to give Karen enough time to get to all the questions.
And I also appreciate that. And I think the great thing about this is it's really giving people an overview of a lot of different topics.
Sure.
And with the opportunity to dive deeper if they want. So
I'm going to also put my my
terrific.
Twitter handle in if anybody likes to. I'm not the best, my wife will say, with the interwebs, but there, my Twitter handle's there if anyone wants to send me a DM.
Great. So in any urban region, the nonprofits are so important. So what about nonprofit social service agencies and local school districts? How do you think they're faring in this year's budget negotiations?
I feel bad, Karen. I feel like I'm giving you nothing but bad news. They're also going to be, I don't want to make it sound like they're getting slashed, but it's lean. I'll start with the easier one first. We passed a schedule in 2017 to gradually increase education cost sharing, which is the main grant we give to local school districts. They are going to get more money. The majority party, the Democrats in the legislature at the start of this year, though, said, look, with all the money coming in, we can do better than the ramp up we passed in 2017. It's a 10-year thing. It takes a long time. It still didn't meet all our goals, and we have more money. Education cost sharing really paid a price throughout the 2000s and the 2010s. Remember what I said about the spending cap? The pension costs just ate up so much of the rest of the budget that municipal aid was kind of on a very lean budget for a long time. Governor Lamont does not want to go beyond, though, the plan that we have right now. And I honestly think that's all the school systems are going to get. So it's not like they're getting cut, but people have said, what we've been doing is too little already for too long, and we need to step up. I think that's going to be a fight for another year. Remember that theme, though, because when we come to the nonprofits, and I want to clarify for people who might not be aware, the overwhelming, but we're not talking just about folks we're not talking about charities, people who are just have a noble cause and they want to do something good for the disadvantaged. We're talking about community-based organizations that are effectively an unofficial arm of state government that are probably, if you went off the budget, the equal of the DMV, the Department of Transportation, and the prison system combined in terms of their size. The overwhelming bulk of the state services that the state provides, the state commissions for the disabled, people struggling with mental illness, abused children, inmate reentry services. We deliver all of that through the private sector. And we work with the private sector because, quite frankly, they're cheaper. We can get them a lot cheaper. Right. The private nonprofit network, and we're talking about hundreds of community-based agencies, estimates that their payments haven't kept pace with inflation for more than 2 decades. If you adjust for inflation, they say they're losing about $480 million a year. I mean, they're never going to get in the budget. We spend, by the way, about $1.3 billion, $1.4 billion on nonprofits here. They're not going to get $480 million more. But they're looking at proposals to get maybe a 1 to a 2.5% increase. That's 20 million, maybe 50 million in the first year, and then nothing in the second. And that right now looks like the best case scenario. They're saying that's going to cause a crisis already today. The state's largest healthcare workers union just went on strike against 6 group home operators. We're talking about folks who serve about 1,400 developmentally disabled clients. 1,700 workers went off the job 3 hours ago.
Yep.
That all comes down to how much money the nonprofits get from the state.
Yes, I think anybody that's watched the news this morning, local news, saw that today and has been seeing all the ads on TV and in newspapers about that. So housing has been a hot topic this year as we face housing shortages and issues with housing affordability statewide. How is this budget being used to address this? And do you think more could be done for this issue?
I do think we're going to see something for housing. The governor's budget had put aside about 600 million over the next 2 years combined. The goal was to create about 6,400 new units, most of which would be affordable housing. Please keep in mind, though, the last estimate we've seen is that we need about 85,000 units of affordable housing. Our eviction rates are up, our homelessness rates are up. I think the bigger question, and I expect though it won't be settled this year, is still, does the state stop using incentives and does the state start using the stick? Governor Lamont has consistently said he does not want to mandate much more on communities. So I think you're going to continue to see incentives, though without taking sides, the criticism of that is some communities, you know, if you're offering the carrot or the stick and they're sitting on a pile of 100 chocolate carrots, you offering them one more is not necessarily going to get them to change their mind.
Right.
That said, I don't know that even if the governor supported it, the votes are there in the General Assembly to pass a mandate.
And another hot topic is transportation. So it's always been a big topic in this session, especially as it relates to the highway use tax, free bus rides, and more. So how is the state handling its transportation fund? And are there areas for improvement there?
Thank you. You just hit, though, my favorite topic. I just want to point something out. Now, we had a gasoline tax holiday that started in April of last year. So it actually started before this fiscal year began last July. And it ran through December and 31st rather, and that it waived the entire 25 cents per gallon retail tax. And then it continued in modified form from January of this year through April 30th. Every year we added a nickel back. So you paid only a nickel tax in January, a dime in February, 15 cents in March, 20 in April. The full tax, 25-cent tax came back May 1. Here's where I'm going with this. That holiday was worth more than $300 million. The state forfeited more than $300 million in revenue, most of which was given up this fiscal year. So you'd think, okay, this is going to be a hard year for the budget's special transportation fund. They did a good thing. They helped folks through inflation, but they lost $300 million plus. We're on pace to finish 13% in the black, 250 million left over. Now, first you go, that's great. So, and again, I'm not trying to take sides. I'm telling you this as a journalist, as an unaffiliated voter. The Republicans came in and said, hey guys, how do we make some of this tax relief permanent? And Governor Lamont said, we can't. I need this money to fix the roads. This dynamic has been going on for the better part of a decade. Well, if we need this money to fix the roads, and by the way, when I say roads, I don't just mean roads. I mean bridges. I mean all of that. Where's the work? And I just want to give you a couple numbers. When Daniel Malloy was in his second term, the state of Connecticut issued an average of $725 million in transportation bonds. Okay. Keep in mind that the way we fix, the primary way we finance the rebuilding of our infrastructure is we borrow money that we pay off with gas tax and sales tax receipts, and we pair that with federal grants. So Governor Malloy was doing $725 million a year. And back then we were hearing from transportation officials, we should be closer to double that if you want to not just keep everything safe, but really get everything up to speed so you can fly through the state. Under Governor Lamont, who's had far more resources because the sales tax part some of our sales tax receipts go to transportation. That's been going through the roof because of inflation. He's basically spending the same amount. Malloy was $725 a year, Lamont $743. So here's the problem, and this is why this all ties in. Governors keep saying, don't worry, one of these days I'm going to spend all this money. Yes, we have a huge surplus, but I can't give it up every single year because eventually I'm going to spend it. Governor Malloy told us that a decade ago. You can have a hose and I can put a kink in it, and I don't care how much you turn on the spigot and have more water pressure. If I don't undo the kink, the same dribble is coming out. And here's the kink. The kink is the Department of Transportation was identified 14 years ago by an investigative panel in the legislature as unable to complete projects on time and under budget. I'm not trying to vilify the DOT. They lack the staffing, they lack the personnel, and they can't get more projects out the door. So yes, I don't think we're collecting enough revenue to actually do the work we need to do to modernize our system. The day we start doing that, you're going to hear tolls discussed again. The only reason we're getting surpluses now is we're still not building any faster than we were a decade ago. That's the problem in transportation. And eventually people are going to say, if you don't start using it, we're going to stop giving it to you, and we're going to give people a permanent gas tax holiday, and you'll just live with the clogged highways you've always had. Sorry, that's the shortest version I can give you of that one.
Okay, so let's do one more and then we'll go to Q&A. So Republicans released their budget this session in addition to the Democrats' budget and the governor's budget. It's a lot to keep up with. Thank God there's people like you that do this. Can you talk to us about the different budget alliances, and where do you see those alliances and negotiations going as we're heading to the end of the session?
Okay, here's how I break it down. We've got a Democratic governor who likes to describe himself as a fiscally moderate, but if you press most Democratic legislators on the side, they'll say he's a fiscal conservative. You have a governor who wants to stay very close to the spending cap. Don't forget, there are tons of ways to get around the spending cap. I could keep us here for 10 hours discussing that if the political will is there. The Democrats have enough moderates that I think they would have a hard time, nor would they want to do something to force a budget down Governor Lamont's throat. They are trying, each side is fighting for the Republican legislators. The Democratic legislators are saying, look, if we don't go too high on spending and we give you enough tax cuts, will you give us a few ways around the spending cap? And we'll just tell Governor Lamont, this is the budget we're doing. If you don't like it, I have D's and R's here. You'll get embarrassed. You veto it, we'll override you. Governor Lamont is going to the Republicans saying, look, stay with me and we'll get the budget we want, and we'll force the Democrats to spend more. And that's why for the last 2 weeks, they've been saying we're on the cusp of a budget deal. But the Republicans deep down want to cut even more than the governor or the Democrats. So while they have the chance to be the kingmakers, they can't quite get their act together and figure out exactly what they want. It is producing, though, what all this inertia is doing. It's producing a budget that is very lean. When you look at the fact that we're running up these massive surpluses, almost all our money is being poured into the pension funds. The argument against that is one generation is trying to unilaterally wipe out the sins of 4 or 5. And by the way, they couldn't do it. We ran up pension debt, guys, over 70 years from 1939 to 2010. Apes will be running the planet before we get a great handle on that pension debt. By the way, that joke no longer works at colleges. I've told that to kids and they look at me and I say, Charlton Heston, Statue of Liberty, no clue. I'm only 58. I'm like, that's it. Get off my lawn. Get out of here, you kids. I don't get it. I'm not saying it's not good to save. I'm just saying, if you didn't brush your teeth for 70 years and went to the dentist, one good flossing won't solve the problem. Yeah. We need to be socking away money for a long time. Yeah. So if you're gutting your healthcare programs or your town aid because you say we're fixing the pensions, you're still going to be gutting it for 20 years. Slow and steady is the only way to fix it.
Yes, that is a challenge everywhere. All right, so it's just about 9:15, so we did want to leave time for questions. So Katie, is there any questions? Do you want me to take them from the chat or do you want to jump in?
Yeah, there's one from Robert Kreitler in the chat if you want to.
Okay. So Jeffrey Sonnenfeld at Yale has done a study on how the pension, speaking of the pension fund, how the pension fund has done just about the worst in the country And if it has done like most states, our budget, if it were done like most states, our budget situation would be much better. Are you aware of this study, and will this have an impact?
Sure, I did. Not fishing for people to leave this chat, please don't, but when it's done, I did have an article that posted yesterday about how that's sort of sparking debate at the Capitol. I think the study's drawn a lot of interest. I think the problem with the pensions is just understanding the scope of the problem. Again, we had a study in 2015 that basically said we underfunded our pensions between 1939 and 2010. I mean, when you save for pensions, you basically, the state sets aside a pot of money when you hire a state employee on day one. And the idea is every year we put aside money, and then every year the treasurer takes that money and invests it. So when John Smith or Jane Doe retires 30, 35 years later, the taxpayers don't have to foot the whole bill. There's a whole ton of investment earnings. Well, if you don't set aside the money, 30 and 40 years later, you've forfeited a ton of money. We left tens of billions of dollars of free money on the table over 70 years by not saving properly. I don't say this to be mean or disrespectful. To a certain extent, that damage is done and there's nothing you can do about it. If every state employee and every municipal teacher on the job today stormed the Capitol with a pitchfork and a torch and demanded you cancel their pension for the good of the state, and said, you can hold in all the money we employees have paid in, you can hold it interest-free until I retire, you'd still face 80% of the problem that you face today. Most of it involves pensions that are owed to people you can't negotiate with, that have already retired. And forgive me for making a crude joke, but unless you know a hitman who works in bulk, you have to basically wait until these folks have passed on and learn from it. All we can do now is you can't even negotiate concessions from them.
Yeah.
Most of the damage is done. That's the situation with the pension fund. And it's hard because voters are understandably infuriated, but if you can build a time machine and go back in time, you could save more.
Yep. It's interesting. It's a conundrum we're in for sure. All right. So here's another question. So this is about ranked choice voting. Where do you see that going? I guess the general consensus is it's not going to be tackled this year, but do you see it coming maybe next year?
I do see it coming back, but this strikes me as one of those issues that's going to take a little bit. I'm just checking one thing while we're talking here. I think it's going to take some time, and I hate to make everything about the budget, but I think part of it is trying to find the time for everything. I think it's an interesting concept. I think a lot of people like the idea of, some people call it, by the way, instant runoff voting. But, if you don't properly vet a topic and you carry it into the last week, there's pretty much anything that can be run into the ground, and there's enough opposition. I don't think leadership would attempt it. So the question is it important enough to bring it up early in the session, prioritize it, and get it done? Maybe next year, but at this point, it would do it a disservice. It just wouldn't pass.
And no, not to name names, but are there legislators that you think would championship this, be the champions for this?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I agree that I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I think definitely on the government administration and elections committee there are. I mean, I think Governor Lamont has been very open to that. And it's not even that it wasn't championed this year because people didn't believe in it. We've all heard the joke about the two things you don't want to see made are laws and sausages. You don't want to watch it while they're being made. I think just the budget got the better of them, which is the case so often. But I mean, I could be wrong. I think there's a very good chance of it passing, just not in 2023.
It's a very interesting concept.
Yes.
So everybody should stay tuned for next year. So I don't see any other questions, but I have one more that we didn't get to.
I feel like I depressed everybody. I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. I think we've covered a lot, which is, I think, like I said, that we've covered a lot of different topics, which is terrific. So let's talk about the child tax credit and child tax deduction. They sound similar, but are very different. Yes. And only one has a chance of passing this year. So where do you see this going as we wind down the session?
I think there is no chance for the child tax deduction. Maybe I should start very quickly with the differential
Yes,
between the two.
please.
And really, you've got to appreciate the federal poverty level to understand where this came from. We have a metric that the federal government has used since the 1960s to try to determine what families have need. Believe it or not, the federal poverty level says for a family of 4 to not be in poverty in the state of Connecticut, they're not in poverty if they make $30,001 a year. Family of 4, 2 adults, 2 kids. Probably living in Connecticut, 4 people on 30 grand. The FPL is an old metric that largely looks at a grocery budget. The United Way has tried to determine a more accurate, what they call survival budget, looking at everything from childcare and healthcare costs, realistic housing expenses. They peg it for a family of 4, again, 2 adults, 2 kids, at a closer to $90,000 a year. Now, some people argue that's too high, but nobody I've met, nobody buys into 30,000. There are some state agencies that don't use the FPL. People frustrated with that a couple years ago began pushing for a child tax credit, something that the state could provide, a dollar for dollar credit on your income taxes for middle class and poor families with kids. The proposal that had the most steam was $600 per child, up to $1,800 maximum for a household. And remember, we said earlier, if a credit is not refundable, you don't get the full value of it. In other words, say you owe $1,000 in taxes and you have 3 kids. Well, you have $1,000 in taxes, you have $1,800 in credit. You don't get an $800 refund. Credits just wipe out what you owe, and that's that. The proposal was to make 70% of these credits refundable, meaning even if you were very poor and you didn't owe taxes, you have to file taxes, but you were getting all your money back. You could get up to $420 per child back to make it an anti-poverty tool. Has a lot of support. Governor Lamont is not a big fan of it, though. Last year, we did a one-time child tax credit, so it was called the child tax rebate. Some folks called it an election stunt, but the fact is it got quite a bit of money to about 90,000 households, and it was only $250 a child. I just don't see the support this year because people recognize the governor doesn't want it. Everybody's prioritizing the income tax rate cut. Republicans offered a child tax deduction. That's just removing a portion of your taxable income. They proposed a $2,000 deduction. Well, if I tax you on $2,000 less at about 5%, that's $100 off your taxes. So it sounds big. A $2,000 deduction is $100 savings. There is a chance for that to pass. It's not big money. The other problem with that, though, is it's not refundable. So if you make less than about $45,000 or $50,000 a year, you would get no benefit from it because you have very little income tax liability to begin with. Therefore, you have the folks who want other tax cuts who aren't voting for the child tax deduction. You have advocates for the poor who aren't voting for it because they don't see the poor benefiting from it, only the middle class. I give it a chance this year, but maybe at best 50-50.
Okay, so we had a couple other questions come in. We still have a few
great.
minutes. So do you think the proposal to raise Medicaid payment rate, do you think the proposal to raise Medicaid payment rates to 65% of the Medicare fee schedule will pass this session?
I give that less than a 50% chance, but I think whoever JJ is who asked the question, thank you, because I think this is going to be probably the biggest issue of the next few sessions. We see so many people who have insurance, but can't get in to see specialists, their doctors. There are more and more doctors who just won't come to Connecticut because if they see Medicaid patients, they don't get enough. I think we're headed for a crisis in that area. I'm going to be accused of being biased. Oh, I'm sorry. JJ is Jillian Jackson. Thank you for that wonderful question. I'm being biased because my wife covers healthcare for the Mirror. So, but the person who's making supper tonight tells me that's a very important issue, and therefore I tend to believe her.
Thank you for that. All right. So another question. We're hearing that there may be a cut in service to Shoreline East rail service. Are you hearing the same thing?
Well, I think what we're talking about is the Republican legislators have said we are spending too much money on transit services. That is one of the faster growing parts of the Special Transportation Fund, but it's always been defended by the huge need for both bus and rail services. They have asked that there be some type of not just study provision in the budget, but some type of a savings built into the second year in the Department of Transportation where they have to find some efficiencies. I don't know if that's going to make it in, but if that is in, you could see that used as the reason to curtail some of Shoreline East. Sorry to be vague, but that's definitely one of the areas that's on the bubble.
And so I think the best question to end with is, with the session winding down, when do you think we're going to see that final budget?
Well, it's got to be done by June 7th. And I'm not just saying this because I'm supposed to report for jury duty 2 days after the session ends. I really think they will get out on time. That said, even if they come out later today, which I'm not predicting, and say we have a deal, you're talking about several days of drafting, caucusing, and getting the votes. I think after we get through Memorial Day, we get into that final week, you will see them vote on a budget. You may see posturing before then, but if you're saying when is the House going to actually call the bill, I'm saying maybe the Tuesday or Wednesday after Memorial Day.
Okay, so we'll all be watching. I'll be watching for that. So Keith, thank you so much for your time today and all the great information that you've given us. It's been really informative and again, covered a lot of topics. If anybody has any questions for you, they have your contact information. They should go on Connecticut Mayor's website. They should subscribe to the newsletters, all of that good stuff. Garrett, or Katie, do you have anything else in closing? We're at 3 minutes left.
No, Keith, we really appreciate it. It was great having you on, and encourage everyone to join the Government Affairs Committee.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Take care.